Good morning, New York State Parent Teacher Association and advocates. We're so excited to be again here with you this morning with three fantastic presenters that are going to talk to you about school aid and the budget and what we're going to be asking on our legislative visits. First, Brian Chetnicki from the Association of School Business Officials. Brian, thanks for being here with us. Bob Lowry is known to you all. He's come and spoken with you a number of years from the Council of School Superintendents, my former partner in crime. Peter Appleby, I guess my other partner in crime, Peter Appleby from the New York State United Teachers. Brian, Bob, and Peter, thanks so much for being here with us this morning.
Thanks for having us.
And I think we're going to jump right in. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what the school aid proposal does. And Bob's going to explain really what is in that proposal that the governor has put out. Brian's going to talk to you a little bit about STAR, something that's very important that we're going to advocate on and how that affects you as a homeowner and person and taxpayer and how it affects your school district. And then Peter's going to wrap us up really talking about our advocacy ask and why it's important that we really advocate on the school budget this year. I'm going to turn things over to Bob to start us off. Bob?
Thanks, Kyle, and thank you for all your interest in this subject and your efforts locally with your schools on behalf of your children. I'll share my screen. Oops, there it is. When the governor's budget first came out, I said that in my over 30 years of dealing with school aid, this was the most confounding proposal, the hardest to understand and to explain. But with this slide, I think it does it as simply as I can come up with. First of all, on the left side, to summarize what's in it. The school aid runs this year include not just traditional school aid, but also STAR property tax reimbursements to school districts and federal stimulus allocations. Foundation aid accounts for over 70% of total school aid statewide. It would be frozen for the second straight year, and that would mean that the state would be over $4 billion behind in phasing in the permanent formula. There are two cuts that the governor proposes. One is in school aid. One is a $1.35 billion or 71% cut applied against the STAR reimbursements for school districts. It's called the local district funding adjustment on school aid runs. And the way this count is calculated, it's the lesser of what districts get from the federal stimulus money that was approved in Washington in December, or their STAR payment. Then there's a second cut. The governor proposes to consolidate 11 categories, aid categories, BOCES, transportation, textbook aid, so forth, into what would be called services aid and cut the total by $693 million or 17% compared to what districts would get if we just let the current formulas run. And the way this cut would be calculated is it would be the lesser of whatever is left from a district's federal stimulus money after that cut against STAR, or a per pupil amount. And in total, the cuts from these two cuts could not exceed a district's federal stimulus allocation. The other formulas on the school aid run, building aid, money for private special education placements, those would be estimated according to the existing formulas. So statewide, you wind up with a $2.1 billion, 7.1% increase. That's made up of a reduction in state support offset by an increase in federal aid. Some observations about the proposal. 7.1% statewide increase sounds great, but it's not representative of what most districts would receive. The median increase would be 2.1%. That means half of all districts would receive less than that. And it includes nearly a quarter of districts that would actually see their total funding go down, notwithstanding this $3.8 billion one-time boost in federal help. Fewer than 1 in 10 districts would actually receive increases in the range of the statewide average or greater. Over 70% of districts would have their entire federal stimulus allocation offset by the two cuts that I've mentioned against STAR and services aid. For some districts, the service aid estimates are skewed by the oddities of what's happened last year and this year, with school buildings being closed and therefore, for example, not transporting school children. That affects districts' transportation aid estimates. The STAR cut is advertised as being intended to be recurring. So that raised the question, what happens when there's no more federal aid? And finally, the budget would allocate the entire $3.8 billion that Congress and the president approved for New York back in December, spend it all in 21-22. So that means without more federal help, next year the state would need to increase its contribution by $3.8 billion just to have districts maintain the current total funding that the proposed budget would provide. On our website, we have something we call it an easier to read school aid run. On the state produced runs, you've got 2020-21 above, 21-22 below. It's hard to see what's happening with the individual aids. We show the years totals side by side, so it makes it easier to see what's driving the overall increase or decrease. I mentioned services aid, more about that below. On runs, these are things that we would not have seen on a school aid run 2 years ago. The pandemic adjustment, the cut against school aid last year that was offset by federal money, shows STAR and so forth, the two federal allocations. The bottom of our so-called easy to read run explains how the services aid proposal would work. Here are the 11 categories that will be consolidated. For the coming year, the state would calculate the amounts for each district according to current law formulas, but then would reduce the total by a reduction factor. Again, it's the lesser of whatever is left in a district's federal stimulus money after the cut against STAR, or a per pupil calculation. Statewide, if we let the formulas run, they would go up by a total of $300 million, but the services aid reduction takes away $693 million. That leaves you with a year-to-year $393 million reduction, from 1 year to the next. The box here at the bottom just summarizes the calculation. But compared to what districts would receive if we just let the formulas run, they would be losing $693 million or 17%. Another point that we emphasize is no district gains from this proposal. If you didn't have a reduction factor in services aid, or you had big increases under the existing formulas, year to year, it might look like your aid is going up, but compared to what you would get under just letting the existing formulas run, no district is better off. They're either the same or get less. So that's an overview of what the governor has proposed with regard to school funding.
And I appreciate that, Bob. I know Peter's going to talk to you a little bit more about the specifics asked, but I want to make sure everyone at home understands that you're going to hear in your meetings that there's this great school aid increase. And, really, as Bob mentioned, there's a big cut to state support for education. And that's really what we have to hammer down on the expense-based aid that Peter's going to talk about. And then O'Brien, can you talk a little bit now about STAR and how STAR works and how that really affects both school aid and homeowners?
Absolutely. So we have produced out on our website an infographic here that helps explain the STAR program, both just the basics of the program and also how the governor's proposal plays into it. It's a new and unique way to cut school aid, but it is essentially a school aid cut. And I think, as Kyle was saying, that's an important advocacy point to get out there, that this is a cut by any other name. It's very similar to the gap elimination adjustment of the early 2010s, which I'm sure many people are aware of. And so it really is just something that's happening to STAR. So to understand why STAR is different from general school aid, first we kind of go back in time before the STAR program, and how it used to work is that school districts would send out property tax bills to residents who would then pay that same amount. So in this example, $1,000 bill, the taxpayer pays the $1,000 and the school district has the money that it was supposed to receive from the levy. Under the original STAR exemption program, which some of you are probably familiar with, you get an exemption on your tax bill, which is essentially a discount on the money that you pay, and that discount is provided for by the state. And so the district still needs $1,000 in this case, but instead of billing you $1,000, they only bill you $700. You pay the $700 to the district, and then the state is providing the $300 difference directly to the district. And so that's the STAR payment that we're referring to with this cut, which I'll get to in a second. But at the end of the day, the district is made whole by a combination of what the taxpayer pays and what the state provides. In recent years, the program has been shifting into a credit program where the mechanics are slightly different, but the net payment by the property taxpayer and the net receipt by the school district are the same. And so what I mean by that is now instead of for individuals who are on the credit program, instead of getting the discount on your tax bill, the district pays or bills you the $1,000. You owe the same $1,000 to the district, so the district is whole. But now instead of the state paying the district $300, they pay you directly $300 through a rebate check. And so your net liability in taxes is still the $700 that it is under the existing STAR program, but the district still gets the full $1,000 that they've billed. What the governor's proposing with this local district funding adjustment is essentially a reduction in the payment that's made to the districts. So this doesn't impact any individuals that are on the credit program. That still works in the same ways that it does now. But what's happening with this proposal is for individuals on the exemption program, the district will bill you the discounted rate. So instead of the $1,000, they'll bill you the $700. You'll only pay the $700 to the district. But now instead of receiving $300 from the state, the district's only receiving $150. And so that's a $150 cut that the district has to make up on its own. In the 21-22 school year, that difference is made up by this $3.8 billion in federal money. But as Bob mentioned, that this cut is a recurring feature moving forward into the future. And so when that money dries up, that cut will always be there. So taxpayers will still be held harmless at this lower property tax bill, but the districts will be losing out on reimbursement from the state. And so that's where our biggest concern, I think as multiple organizations here on what that means for the fiscal future for districts, because this is, as proposed, a permanent reduction in payments that go to the district. Doesn't matter that it's through the STAR program or from other mechanisms. Districts will receive less money in the future as a result of this.
So Brian, I want to make sure our members understand and I understand. And thanks for these graphics. And Bob, thanks for your graphics in that, in the new STAR proposal, the districts are the one getting the cut. So the homeowner is still going to pay the same taxes, but the district itself is you're an example going to receive half of what it used to.
Correct. Yep. And I will say that the governor has proposed some other changes to STAR that impact the taxpayers. And really it's just many of his proposals are trying to incentivize people from moving off of the exemption program onto the credit program. Right now, you only really move from the exemption to the credit program when you purchase a new home, but he's really trying to incentivize people to move off of the exemption entirely. But in the meantime, those that are on the exemption, it results in this, his proposals will result in this cut to school districts.
Yeah, and again, another cut to school districts, which is really alarming. Peter, let's talk about an overall kind of picture on school aid and really what we have to advocate for.
Well, before I talk about 21-22, we're still dealing with issues for 2021, which is a bit unusual. Usually by this time, the current year school aid situation has resolved itself. That is not the case this year. On the good news front, as people will recall, the budget division started withholding some state aid payments beginning in last July and August of about 20%. They didn't continue that through the fall and winter, but there were several $100 million that was withheld from school districts. The governor's office has announced that those funds will be repaid. So those 20% withholdings are coming back to school districts, and the education department has indicated publicly that process has begun. So hopefully that is behind us and the withholding issue is in the rearview mirror. The second issue for 2021, which is part of our advocacy that's ongoing, last spring, when school buildings were closed, districts used their transportation systems, both their own employees or contracted employees, if that's their system in that district, to provide remote Wi-Fi access, to deliver meals. And because of the way the federal ballot package worked last spring, districts were instructed to maintain employment levels throughout the year. Unfortunately, the way the state law works for transportation aid, those sorts of costs are not aidable under transportation aid. So those are 19-20 school year costs. They'd be aidable in the 2021 school year. The governor's proposal does allow for some of those costs to be aidable, things like using buses for Wi-Fi access points or delivering meals, but he does not cover what are called standby costs, where individuals were maintained on district employment throughout the year to comply with the original federal bailout package, the CARES Act, that Congress passed last March. So we're still having to get a resolution on that, and hopefully friends in the legislature will fix this to ensure that 2021 transportation aid is paid in full. So that's 2021. Now for 21-22, there are two significant issues that people are advocating around, and Bob touched on both of them, and Brian gave kind of a more technical explanation of how one of them is working. The first one is services aid. That is the combination of 11 aid formulas into a block grant, which is then cut. Those aid formulas that would be eliminated include BOCES aid, transportation aid. So it's a bit odd. The governor is fixing transportation aid for 2021, but eliminating it for 21-22 and thereafter. A little bit confusing. Also, all the instructional materials aid, software, hardware, library materials, and textbooks would also be eliminated under shared service, under the services aid proposal. And that's almost a $700 million cut against expected funding levels. So restoration of that is probably number one on the list. And then number 1A would be the local district funding adjustment. That's a negative $1.35 million formula, like the old GEA, that cuts below the line to all school districts across the state in a permanent way. It's a recurring cut. Now, some of this is papered over by the federal funds, as Bob mentioned, but still leaves districts short funded for 21-22. And in 22-23, there's a very large funding cliff. So we need ongoing state support. We don't need the one-time federal money is fine, but we need ongoing state support to support our ongoing educational expenditures.
This is extremely helpful, Peter, and I just want to do a quick summary for us and then talk a few questions. So one, our members need to tell their legislators, we say no to the local district funding formula. We need to say no to any state cut. We need to say no to those star cuts. We need to say no to the expense-based aid cuts. And we need to say yes to fixing the transportation aid proposal. Are those the big asks, gentlemen?
Yes, I would just amend about the service aid proposal. It's both the cut and the proposal to consolidate the 11 formulas that are problematic. It would eliminate predictability in funding for school districts, and could be very damaging to BOCES. BOCES aid would be one of the aid categories that would be consolidated, and there'd be no assurance for districts that if they spent more on BOCES in the future, that they would get more help from the state in paying for those costs. So it could be very damaging to BOCES and the opportunities that they provide for school children.
Yeah, and I think
Also,
that I totally agree. Peter?
I was gonna say, also, the services cut in particular is regressive. Because our formulas are progressive and give a higher reimbursement rate to low-income areas, when you eliminate the formula, you're disproportionately taking from poor and low-income school districts. So it's a regressive cut. It damages BOCES, as Bob said. It damages their ability to deliver services, and it puts the burden on those least able to pay on their own to try to figure out what to do.
And Peter, you're talking about that expense-based aid formula. So I want to make sure everyone understands that. So that is regressive in nature, meaning that it impacts poor school districts at higher rates. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Brian, any other thoughts on this before we talk some questions?
I think, Bob and Peter have summarized the issues pretty well. And again, to reiterate this idea of the fiscal cliff, the optics right now look great because of this federal money that districts are going to receive in 21-22. But this is really setting us up for, what we went through in the early 2010s with the gap elimination adjustment. And it took 5 years for the state to dig out of that hole. We're putting ourselves right back in that position if this proposal gets enacted.
And so our members are going to have limited time, as you understand. And we're talking maybe a half hour with legislators on a number of priority issues. To repeat the ask, we need to say no to the local district funding formula changes, that cut. We need to say no to any other state cut, because state support for schools is cut. I want to make sure everyone understands that. So while your legislators may say, oh no, there's a $2.1 billion increase in school aid, you're going to say no. That's federal money, and the state support for school aid has been cut. You're going to say no to that STAR cut. We're going to say no to the expense-based aid cut and the changes in the formula. And we're going to ask to fix that transportation aid proposal. If they had to focus their beginning of the meeting on the most priority issues, what say you? Tough question.
Yep.
What do you think, Bob?
Well, first of all, I think make clear that, the 7% statewide increase is not representative of every district. Our easy to read school aid run, can help to illustrate that point. And I should have said, that's right on our website.
And we're going to send that to everybody. So you've already gotten that email.
Yeah. So, and that also shows a line that the change in state funding as opposed to change in total funding. So, that's the first thing to emphasize. If I had to pick one thing, I would probably say the proposal to consolidate 11 aid categories into service aid and cut those. That's the thing that I would start with.
And I think that's great. And I want to make sure that everyone picked up from Bob's presentation that 70% of schools, Bob, and correct me if I'm wrong, are receiving flat, and 23% of schools are actually getting cut under this proposal. Is that correct?
Well, what I was saying was that, in terms of total funding, even with the federal money, nearly a quarter of districts would actually see their total funding go down. But a separate issue that I mentioned was with the cuts against STAR and services aid, those cuts would completely absorb the entire federal stimulus allocation for over 70% of our districts. So they would be getting no help from Washington in paying for the exceptional pandemic related costs that districts have had to absorb.
Yeah, that's incredible. Peter, last thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. Services aid would be number one because it's a permanent structural change to so many important formulas. If those formulas go away, they're probably gone permanently. Certainly the local district funding adjustment is a bad thing, but it is something we've dealt with before. It's a different type of GEA below the line cut, but we have bought those back. If BOCES aid goes away, you're not going to get it back. That would I put first on the list.
Thanks, Peter. Brian?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think, both from a budget politics standpoint, it's the easier one, I think, for the legislature to buy back because it's less money. But it's also, as Peter said, it's the most permanently damaging of these proposals, and really should be the focus of sort of number one on the list.
So I'm going to go through them again and then thank our presenters. We're happy to take questions on this. I know this is super complicated. I know people have been texting in the chat box as we've been moving forward. Again, we're going to say no, and I'm going to switch the order to our members. We're going to say no to those expense-based aid cuts and formula changes. Okay, number one. So I'm going to repeat it again. So we want to write it down. We're going to say no to our expense-based aid cuts and formula changes. That's in the school aid memo you've all received already. We're going to say no to that local district funding formula cuts. We're going to say no to that. We're going to say no to any state cuts. We're going to say no to those STAR cuts. We're going to talk about that transportation aid issue, how to fix that transportation aid formula. And Bob's point's really important to remember that these other cuts for 70% of school districts, Bob, repeat that again.
Yeah, I was saying, the state is getting $3.8 billion in federal aid allocating to school districts, but for over 70% of the districts, their allocation would be entirely offset by proposed cuts in state support, meaning they're not getting any help from Washington in paying for the exceptional pandemic-related costs that they've had to absorb.
And again, 1/4 of school districts underneath Governor Cuomo's executive budget actually receive an overall school aid cut. Is that accurate, gentlemen?
Yes.
Correct.
I can't thank you enough. We've actually gone, if you can imagine, just about 25 minutes. It flew by. You know, and I think on behalf of PTA, we want to thank your members for your partnership. As you all know, in PTA, we are part of the Educational Conference Board and work very closely with many associations, especially the school business officials, superintendents, our teachers union, our principals, our school boards, and our conference of Big Five city school districts. We're so grateful for your partnership, and on behalf of our members, please thank your members for everything they do to support every children. Thank you so much, Peter, Bob, and Brian, and have a great day, everybody. We're going to transition into our next presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.